this. Bacteria are all single-celled. Okay? When we talk about bacteria, we are talking about only single-celled organisms. And they come in a variety of shapes. You can have round bacteria or rod-shaped bacteria. Those are sort of the two primary shapes. There are also some weirder ones. There are, and I'm going to struggle to draw this, I know, right off the bat. There are these things that look like corkscrew pasta. Let's see. We'll do this and say it will suffice. There are these spiral bacteria. I didn't draw that very well. But they're all single-celled, 3 basic shapes, and you're right, they are everywhere. They're in the air. There are bacteria that live in the atmosphere. There are bacteria. It turns out that bacteria in the upper atmosphere are one of the things that help it to rain, because rain, the moisture can't condense unless there's a surface of some sort, and bacteria provide a surface. So bacteria can actually sort of trigger rain. They are on your skin, they're in your mouth, they're in your gut, they're on the floor, they're on the desks, they're on the plants. And a few of you mentioned we can't live without them. Is that something you knew prior to having biology? I mean, I talk about it a lot. I'm kind of obsessed with it. And some of you already knew it. That's good. Tiny living organisms. Reproduce asexually. That's an important point. So bacteria reproduce asexually. What does that look like? Do you remember the whole hand gestures thing for sexual versus asexual reproduction we did at the beginning of the year? So sexual reproduction, 2 cells become 1 cell. Asexual reproduction, 1 cell splits into 2 new cells. Did that ring any bells? Okay. So when a bacteria reproduces, this bacteria here, for instance, I'll copy that, bring it over here. This sort of gets elongated and does that. I'm going to shrink these guys. And then pop, splits into 2 new bacterial cells. And then guess what? You got 2 new bacterial cells that are identical to what's called the mother cell. So you have mother cells and daughter cells. So they reproduce asexually. This process is actually, it's got a special name. It is called binary. What does the prefix bi mean? 2. Binary fission. And to fission is to split. So binary fission is where 1 cell splits into 2. And you're actually going to have a quiz on this Friday. There will be a quiz on this. So that's how they reproduce. They reproduce asexually. What do you know about asexual reproduction? We just said that the daughter cells are identical to the mother. So bacteria, interestingly enough, they have this little sort of single chromosome. They don't have a nucleus, they just have a single chromosome. Before they can split into 2 new cells, what would they have to do to their DNA?
Replicate it.
Yeah, they have to replicate it. They have to copy it. So you end up with 2 copies of that same DNA. Is copying DNA perfect?
No.
No. So every now and then, now, you know, do you think there would be more or less variety in something that reproduces asexually? Yeah, there's less, because for the most part they're identical. With us, you're getting half your DNA from your mother, half from your father. You only get to pass on half your DNA, which means you get a lot of variety because you're mixing up genes all the time. With these guys, unless there is a mutation, I'm going to change one little portion of that DNA, because if there's a mutation, then in fact we do get something that is different. And sometimes that does happen. Sometimes we get a little bit of a mutation and we get one bacteria that is slightly different than its parent cell. Okay, great. So let's go back to what you know about bacteria. Okay, based on your answers to this, I'm going to say you're the healthiest bunch of folks I've ever seen. A lot of people said, nope, I've never had a bacterial infection. Baloney. Have you ever had a pimple? A whitehead? A little pussy pocket of pus? That's an infection. That's a bacterial infection of a pore. The pus, the white stuff in a pimple, is white blood cells that your body has sent to the scene to clean up the bacteria. Have you ever had strep throat? That's a bacterial infection. Have you ever had a cut that got a little bit red and pussy? That's a bacterial infection. So most of you have probably had bacterial infections. If you've had bronchitis, that's very often a bacterial infection of the bronchi, of the small chambers of the lungs. So most of you have probably had a bacterial infection, but we don't always know what we're sick with, especially when you're a kid. You kind of are trusting somebody else to take care of that for you. A few people mentioned viruses, and viruses are different than bacteria. We'll talk just a little bit about the differences between the two of them. But many of you, if you've had, again, strep, tonsillitis is usually bacterial. Bronchitis is typically bacterial. Pimples are little tiny bacterial infections. Pussy cuts are bacterial infections typically. When you get a cut, for how many of you is it standard practice to have somebody, whoever, whether you're at this age, you're probably doing your own care for cuts, but to put a little bit of antibiotic ointment on it, a little bit of Neosporin on it. Okay, that's to prevent that cut getting pussy. Okay, so let's go on and talk about the next bit. Okay, so you guys have taken some antibiotics. And let's break down this word. What does anti mean? Yeah, anti means against. What does bio mean? Life. A biotic factor is what? A living thing in an ecosystem. So we could even say biotic. An antibiotic is literally against living things. So an antibiotic is literally something that is working against the living things in your body. A couple things to note. You can be sick and it's not a bacterial infection. So you can have, for instance, to think about really serious illnesses, cancer. That's not a bacterial infection. People take drugs for cancer. They're not antibiotics. An infection and just an illness are different. You can have something like MS. It's not a bacterial infection. It's an autoimmune disorder. The body is attacking itself. So you can have a lot of diseases or illnesses that are not bacterial in nature. Antibiotics only work against bacteria because antibiotics only work against living things. So if you have some sort of disease or disorder or something else that's like, your body isn't doing what it's supposed to. Diabetes is one. Some of you probably know people who have diabetes, either type 1 or type 2. And the body doesn't produce a chemical that helps it break down sugar. It doesn't produce insulin. Pardon?
Some diabetics cannot get rid of.
Well, for people who are type 2 diabetics, which is the kind that adults usually get, they can modify their diet real early on in having diabetes, and sometimes they can avoid the need for drugs, yes. People who are type 1 diabetics, and that's the kind where your pancreas never worked, there's a genetic defect in your pancreas, you are just dependent on getting shots of insulin for the rest of your life, because your body's never going to do what it's supposed to. Yeah, for people who have type 2 diabetes, which you might have a grandparent or a parent or an aunt or an uncle who has type 2 diabetes, if it's caught early, you can sometimes kind of correct it with diet. So those are things where you wouldn't take an antibiotic because antibiotics are only effective against infections with bacteria, against living things. Some of the really common ones, like if you've who here has had strep throat? Okay, that's a bacterial infection. And when you have strep, they typically give you one of a couple things, like a penicillin derivative, erythromycin, trying to think what else they give. And if you have bronchitis or an upper respiratory infection, they very often give you like a Z-Pak. It's zithromycin. Okay. The thing to remember here. Not all drugs are antibiotics. Not all drugs are antibiotics. Antibiotics are a very specific type of drug. Okay, tell me everything you know about how antibiotics work. I know nothing. They kill the bacteria. They try to kill all the infected cells in your body. Antibiotics kill bacteria. They do their job. You get better. Okay. They shoot antibiotics into your bloodstream and it kills some bacteria. They kill harmful bacteria. It helps you get out what shouldn't be there. They kill the bacteria. Okay. So, a couple things to note. How do antibiotics work? How do antibiotics work? Well, it depends on the antibiotic. There are a lot of different kinds of antibiotics. They kill bacteria, that's for sure. And bacteria are kind of interesting. Here, I'll actually draw a cone-shaped bacteria this time. So that's a bacillus bacteria. Okay. So bacteria, like plants, have an extra layer of protection around their cells. Most bacteria have a cell wall. Okay. And there are antibiotics rather, that kill bacteria by attacking the cell wall. There are antibiotics that attack how bacteria reproduce. There are antibiotics. There are a lot of different ways for antibiotics to work, and we'll talk a little bit about some of them. But there are different ways for them to work. In general, though, yes, all antibiotics kill bacteria. That's what they do. Do they kill all bacteria? What do you think? Do antibiotics kill all bacteria?
No, some are immune to it.
Okay, so we've got the issue of some are immune to them. What else?
Aren't they just suited to kill certain bacteria?
It depends. It depends. So we have two kind of large classes of bacteria. We have what are called broad spectrum. What kind of bacteria do you think broad spectrum kill? What does that sound like to you? This is going to sound like, I don't know, something from a video game or something else. Kill everything! Sorry. Broad spectrum antibiotics kill everything. Kill all. This is like nuclear war on antibiotics in your body. This is like dropping an atomic bomb. Has anybody here ever had to take an antibiotic and then gotten diarrhea? No? Okay, you guys are lucky. You're resilient. You're young. When you take, remember we said your gut is full of bacteria. Without the bacteria in your gut, you couldn't digest your food. Well, when you take a broad spectrum antibiotic, guess what? It can kill all the bacteria in your gut, too. And if you kill all the bacteria in your gut, guess what? You can't digest your food until your gut repopulates. And so for a lot of people, and some people are more sensitive to this than others, take that broad spectrum antibiotic, kill off a lot of the bacteria in your gut, you're going to have diarrhea until your gut builds up some more bacteria. And very often they'll tell people, drink yogurt or drink buttermilk or eat some yogurt, because that's got some of the same kinds of bacteria in it that live in your gut. So when you drink those things, some of those bacteria stay behind in your gut and they help repopulate your gut. So broad spectrum antibiotics are really rough on you. They're hard on you. They kill all your bacteria, not just the ones that are making you sick. So we have another sort of group of bacteria. So the other thing we have is targeted antibiotics. And targeted antibiotics, what do you think they do? Yeah, they kill certain types of bacteria. So we'll sum that up as kill some. So targeted antibiotics are great because they only kill certain bacteria. And very often they kill bacteria based on something about the bacteria, like how it reproduces or what kind of chemicals that particular bacteria has in its cell wall, or some other feature of just that bacteria. So they're a lot better from that kind of perspective. Okay, so now we're going to watch the preview for a film that we're going to start tomorrow. Tomorrow you're going to get a study guide for this, but I want to, I guess I want to give you fair warning. This is disturbing. It should, my hope is not that it scares you, but that it concerns you into action. And a few of you already said, like, you got to take all the antibiotics, and you shouldn't take them for viruses. Good. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of that and do some sort of examples. But we're going to start off with, this is from a program called Frontline, and the title of the show was Hunting the Nightmare Bacteria. Okay. So I guess before that, let me ask you this. Okay, you've had tonsillitis. You've had like an infected cut. Is an infected cut going to kill you?
Yeah, good.
Well, today, probably not. What about 100 years ago?
Yes.
Yes. The world that you don't know and I don't know is the world before antibiotics. So if we do a timeline, so let's say all of human history up until, who knows when antibiotics were first developed or widely used?
1980.
No, later than that. Later than that. There was a world historical event that really led to some of the first widespread use of antibiotics, and they were miracles.
World War I.
World War I. And it took off from there. By World War II, they were widely used. So, you know, did you say 1918 or 1818? Did you mean 19? Yeah. So we'll say, you know, approximately 1915, somewhere in there. Well, it starts in 1914, ends in 1918. So approximately 1915. From there on, we have the age of antibiotics. Oh! 1928 is what they give as the first use of what?
Penicillin.
First use of penicillin? Okay. And prior to the age of antibiotics, I want to tell you that people not only died of minor cuts, they died of toothaches. They died of pneumonia all the time.
I feel like I would rather die when I would toothache.
Well, yeah, if you've ever had a toothache for a long time. But I imagine that the days and weeks leading up to your eventual death from toothache are pretty awful, because a toothache is a bacterial decay of your teeth. Well, those bacteria can get into your bloodstream, and you get a systemic infection, and I think the pain of a toothache is probably nothing compared to the pain of dying from a bacterial infection from a toothache.
Somebody's killing me.
Huh? Oh yeah, I'd rather you just take my head off at the neck than live through that. Well, you wouldn't live through it. Yeah, people died of simple infections that we take for granted the ability to treat today. And none of us have lived in that world. Not one of us have had to live in that world. And that's really a serious thing, because what I'm going to tell you is that we may all end up not living in that world. The age of antibiotics is very likely to come to an end. And we've had, about 100-year run where we had these magical wands that we could wave at bacterial infections, and they just went away. And this was unheard of. And that may come to an end. So we're going to watch the trailer for Hunting the Nightmare Bacteria. We'll discuss it a little bit, and then tomorrow we're going to start.